Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Spratt from Sports Info Solutions. I'm joined, as always, by Aaron Schatz of Football Outsiders. Before we get the show rolling, I want to remind everyone that the Off the Charts Football Podcast is presented to you by FantasyInsiders.com, your source for daily fantasy sports content. They believe that accuracy matters, and it shows since they've won the daily fantasy accuracy competition for the past 3 seasons. If you're serious about DFS or want to become serious, head over to FantasyInsiders.com for free educational content and premium memberships. Aaron, a week ago on the show, we were talking about how interesting it was that all 4 road teams had won in the first week of the playoffs, and then all of a sudden all 4 home teams win. So when we were excited for potentially an up-in-the-air, upheaval kind of driven playoffs, now it seems like we have the 4 teams that everybody expected from the start.
Yeah, boy, the whole, everything seems unsure because the top teams are the wild card teams. That didn't really come to fruition, although, somewhat it was partly because they were all close games, so it's not like the wild card teams played particularly badly. And obviously injuries played a big role in the Pittsburgh loss. But, here we are with the top 4 teams that were generally the top 4 teams for most of the season. I mean, for most of the season, there were 5 teams that were sort of ahead of the rest of the league, and only 4 of them can make the Final Four. So,
of course,
thanks to the Andy Dalton injury, Cincinnati got left out.
Pretty much. And while this may be kind of chalky in terms of who's playing, we still have some really interesting matchups to talk about today. Let's get it started by talking about the early game on Sunday, the Patriots versus the Broncos. Last week, we talked a lot about the Broncos-Steelers matchup and how interesting it was that it seemed like neither offense had the right setup or, I guess, health status in terms of the Steelers to take advantage of the bigger weakness of the other team's defense. And I think that may be an interesting story again this week. We talked last week that the Broncos are really stout on short passes, but weaker against deep passes. With Roethlisberger and Antonio Brown hurt last week, they couldn't really go downfield super well. We think of the Patriots, too, as being sort of a short passing attack. I know that Brady himself threw only 11% of his passes for 20-plus yards in the air. That was in the bottom third of the league. Does it strike you that the Patriots may have a similar issue to the injured Steelers last week in going down the field and taking advantage of that Broncos weakness?
Yes, this is not a good defense for the Patriots to face. I think that the public conventional wisdom that the Patriots are going to win this game easily seems wrong to me. It totally discounts the quality of the Denver defense and home field advantage, and the fact that the strengths of the Denver defense are exactly what you don't want them to be if you are the Patriots. They are not a good deep passing team. Last week, Brady only threw 2 passes that were qualified as deep, over 15 yards through the air, including that one weird one where there were 2 receivers in the same area because it looked like, someone ran a wrong route.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he faced, when Miami in Week 17, that was the worst defense in the league this year against deep passes. Worst defense in the league. And they lost to Miami. And Brady went 0 for 7 on passes thrown 11 or more yards in the air. Not even 16. 11 or more yards in the air. And no Edelman that day. But Edelman's not a deep route guy anyway.
No, he's not stretching the field.
Is, right, he gets open quickly and helps counteract the other problem that they have with the Broncos defense, which is that the Broncos have a superlative pass rush this year. Now, it's been off a little bit in recent weeks. DeMarcus Ware has had some injury problems. But the Broncos led the league in adjusted sack rate. Interestingly, Denver and New England are the top 2 teams in the league in adjusted sack rate. The Denver brought pressure more than any other defense in the league. And this offensive line for the Patriots has problems holding up for more than a couple of seconds. They didn't against Kansas City, but, of course, Kansas City's got injuries. So this is not a good defense for the Patriots to match up against.
That's for sure. So the Broncos on the season had 218 sacks, pressures, hurries, and hits. That's the 3rd most in the league. The Chiefs were 5th, but like you said, Justin Houston could barely even play last week. That wasn't really a major factor in the game. The offensive line for the Pats only allowed 3 of those pressures and hits against Brady. But that may not have all been about the Chiefs' ineffectiveness. I think we noticed a major split during the season with the Patriots' offensive line that also was related to the health of the team. Weeks 1 through 9, the Patriots allowed the 14th fewest sacks, pressures, hits, and hurries. But then weeks 10 to 17, they allowed the 6th most. I mean, that kind of really jibes with the health of that offensive line. And frankly, guys like Edelman, who themselves getting open quickly helps Brady get rid of the ball more quickly.
Right.
So it may be the
Vollmer
case that,
Vollmer and Edelman, because Edelman helps him get the ball out quickly, and Vollmer provides the best protection. With Nate Solder out, Vollmer's the best offensive lineman, even if he's playing out of position at left tackle instead of right tackle. But it's funny. Last week against Kansas City, the Patriots had their highest offensive DVOA of the entire year. But I don't think you can then expect that they're going to do that again against Denver on the road.
Right.
I think that there's a little bit of random chance involved there. New England's top 4 offensive games of the year by DVOA were the first 3 weeks of the year and this week against Kansas City. So it's not like this was a return to the offensive level of before Edelman got hurt. The offensive level for most of the games before Edelman got hurt was not as good as they were against Kansas City. I think there's a little bit of flukiness in the offensive performance against Kansas City because of the fact that they were at home, because the injuries to the Kansas City pass rush, because of weird plays like the ball that was caught by a guy when there were 2 guys in the same area, or the one at the end of the game where it was almost a pick by Tamba Hali, and instead it bounced into Julian Edelman's hands to seal the game. Now, the flip of this, of course, is that even if the Broncos defense is so good and the offense of the Patriots is a little overrated right now, can the Broncos score enough points to even make it a game?
Exactly.
Even if their defense can limit the Patriots somewhat. And I think that's sort of the big question of this game.
And we saw that a little bit with the Steelers last week. I know we talked about how the Steelers were just generally a lot better defensively than a lot of people realized, and especially been playing better as the season went on. But again, the Steelers, I think the major split there that worked well against the Broncos was how good the Steelers are against the short passing game. We saw last week again with Manning. I mean, it's the same story that it's been all year, where he's not going down the field either. He's throwing the ball on short routes, short outs, and they're just running the ball a ton. How does that sort of mesh up with what the Patriots do best and worst on defense?
Well, it's sort of interesting. The Patriots defense ranked 15th against deep passes and 22nd against short passes. So it looks like there is a weakness there against short passes. But it's a little more complicated than that, because the Patriots tend to get a lot of sacks, but not necessarily a lot of pass pressure, because there's a lot of coverage sacks, which means throws both deep and short that are just not being thrown because the coverage is good and then the pass rush gets there. They blitz less than any other team in the league. So it's a complex question about whether they really are weak against short passes or not.
Interesting.
As well as, I think, a complex question of, is the Broncos offensive will their pass rush overwhelm the Broncos offensive line or not? Because it's not like they're blitzing a ton, but they're not necessarily winning with 4 a lot either. But when they do bring pressure, they tend to make it count with a lot of sacks. Like I said, second in the league in adjusted sack rate. And the other thing, of course, the Broncos are going to want to run a lot, right? That's how they beat the Patriots the first time these two teams played. But, of course, all the injuries in that game, for the Patriots, the injuries in that game included Jamie Collins didn't play, and Dante Hightower, I believe, went out early in the game. That
sounds right.
And there are questions about them for this week, but it does look like they're going to play. And overall, the Patriots' run defense has improved significantly over the course of the season. Weeks 1 through 6, they allowed 5 yards a carry with a DVOA that was about average against the run. Week 7 and onwards, they only allowed 3.8 yards per carry. This includes last week, so it includes the playoff. And their run defense DVOA was 22% below average, so which means better than average, actually, because it's defense.
Right.
So
yeah.
Their run defense has been much better in recent weeks, and that number includes the Denver game where it wasn't good. So if you only include games where where Collins and Hightower were healthy, it was really good. And I think they're going to be much better at stopping the Denver run than they were the first time that these two teams played.
So, I mean, it sounds to me like this game could be, fewer than 20 points for both teams here. It could be a real defensive struggle.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think people think about it like that, but it is, that's just Denver. Denver's just strong defense, bad offense. And I mean, not as bad as last week because they're not going to have quite as many dropped passes. But at the same time, you can't count on the Patriots fumbling the ball away to you on their big last drive the way Pittsburgh did.
True.
Again, random chance. So, I mean, I think this game is more 50-50 than most people realize. I don't think I would favor Denver. The Patriots, I think, are the better team given current health. But I think that it's going to be more of a low-scoring defensive battle than people realize.
I mean, the biggest reason that's probably a surprise isn't because of the way the teams have played this year, because obviously both of the teams have had excellent defenses, but it's because it's, headline Brady versus Manning. So this is a kind of game where you're like offense, and it may not be there. And I wanted to talk a little bit specifically about the matchup of those two quarterbacks, because Scott Casimir wrote a really interesting article on ESPN Insider that everyone should check out, basically comparing the two players. I think at this point everyone knows that Peyton has had not a ton of success in the playoffs relative to his regular season success. His teams are 12-13 in playoff games, while Brady's teams are 22-8. Huge disparity there. But, this show is all about talking about how a one-loss record isn't necessarily the best way to evaluate players. And Casimir's interesting point was how many critical 50-50 plays basically sabotaged Manning in his playoff games, like Mike Vanderjagt missing multiple clutch field goals. If you remember Raheem Moore just falling over against Joe Flacco, basically throwing that deep bomb to win the game in the Ravens' march to the Super Bowl that year. Meanwhile, for Brady, a lot of really positive 50-50 plays have helped him win games, Adam Vinatieri being the anti-Vanderjagt. You've got the Tuck Rule game. I know those are just a few examples, but if some of those start going the other way, you can sort of see how their records might be a little bit closer than they actually are in reality. Aaron, I was curious whether you had any advanced stats about their performances that maybe would indicate that Manning has been a little bit better than his record would indicate, or maybe have even been as good as Brady potentially in the playoffs.
Sure. I mean, listen, some of it is, I think, about the distribution of performance, right? Manning has a couple of playoff games that are just ridiculous, ironically against Denver for the most part, early in his career, and those help to balance out the really bad playoff games like the Super Bowl against the Seahawks or the 2003 was it the 2003 game against the Patriots was his really bad one. I think 2003, if I remember correctly, was the really bad one. 2004 was the one where the rest of the Colts essentially gave the game away. There were the receiver fumbled. I think Reggie Wayne fumbled. I think Edgerrin James fumbled in that game. Like Manning would hit passes, and then the receivers would fumble, and then people would blame Manning for it.
Right.
So,
yes.
If you look at their careers, Manning's DVOA, passing DVOA in the playoffs is 26.8%, and Brady's is 23.3%.
Wow.
So that doesn't mean Manning was better, right? Because it's a small difference. It means they were roughly equal. I'll point out that ESPN's QBR comes out with similar results. It has Manning with 66 in the playoffs and Brady with 59.4. So, Manning has been much better in the playoffs than people are willing to give him credit for. There have been a lot of issues with teammates, whether it's fumbles by teammates or missed field goals by Vanderjagt or bad performances by the defense. And for Brady, it's sort of been the opposite. Now, I mean, listen, you could also talk about the two Super Bowls in 2007 and 2011, where Brady gave his team a lead in the final minutes, and then the defense gave it up.
Speaking
what'd you say?
So speaking of fluke plays, some of the plays that cost him those Super Bowls were crazy.
Right,
obviously
absolutely.
The Tyree catch.
Although there were those were actually extended drives, right? The thing about Scott's article is he picked just single plays. Like all that matters is single plays. Imagine Vinatieri misses a field goal to send a game to overtime. Imagine that Sterling Moore does not slap the ball out of Lee Evans' hands in 2011 NFC Championship game. Like with the two Giants Super Bowls, like even if you take away those plays, right? If Tyree doesn't make that catch, it's 4th and 5. Although, in my humble opinion, obviously informed as a Patriots fan, I will admit The real problem with that play was that Mike Carey did not call Manning down in the grasp, which he should have. If you read the book Scorecasting, it points out that the average amount of time that was used to call a sack in the grasp in the NFL, that play went on like twice as long or something as the average amount of time that you call a sack in the grasp. Like Carey just let him go and go and go. But even if, that's 4th and 15, the Giants still have another chance. The Manningham catch in 2011 was just one play in a whole drive, right? That doesn't explain 2007 Ellis Hobbs letting the Plaxico Burress catch a touchdown over his head. But so, yeah, I mean, Brady has had mistakes by his defense too, but not quite as much as Manning. Manning really has. I mean, he has had his team in playoffs games over and over again that they've then lost because of defense and special teams errors. Yeah, now everything will be reversed.
Yeah. It's really just a shame that Manning isn't physically what he was, because otherwise this matchup would be really cool as like a legacy game, what it could potentially mean to Manning.
Be totally one-sided.
Yeah.
If you put the Manning of old on this Denver team, you would have one of the best teams in the history of the NFL. Maybe the best team in the history of the NFL.
Yeah.
Given the quality of this defense and the fact that they have reasonably good special teams, which is rare for Denver, because Denver tends to always overrate its kickers and punters because they don't understand what altitude does to their kicking and punting numbers. This is better special teams than we're used to from Denver to just be average. This team, if you put a top 2 or 3 offense on that team with Manning as Manning used to be, this wouldn't be a great ending to this rivalry. This would be an ass kicking.
Well, even without, I'm still really looking forward to it. I love these sort of defensive-minded games, and I think this one could be excellent. Let's move on to the other game, the Cardinals at the Panthers. This one has a lot of intrigue. Obviously, the games last week were both really compelling. From the Cardinals-Green Bay one, you don't really need to say a ton about that, but the Hail Mary at the end, it was just insanity.
Oh, we wrote a ton about that.
Of course.
Because we all just sat there we all just sat there for hours afterwards trying to process it, and then everybody from Football Outsiders just wrote a ton on Sunday morning trying to understand that thing.
So, I mean, the thing that stood out to me, I mean, obviously the game was nuts going back and forth and everything else, but Carson Palmer looked a little shaky to me with some of his throws and some of his decision-making, especially in the second half. And I was curious. There were a lot of potential things that were at play there for him. One was the fact that obviously he had never won a playoff game before and had pretty limited playoff experience just because of some of the bad teams he used to play for. There's also the fact that Green Bay's pass rush, was started to play a little bit better of late. And then finally, he had the finger injury where he had basically the tape on his finger. They showed that a lot during the game, and potentially that was causing him to make some inaccurate throws. Just based on what you know, or maybe just your guesses, how do you feel like those 3 factors came into play for Palmer, and could that then be a factor against the Panthers as well this week?
I don't know. This is a tough one because, the numbers from the rest of the season don't back up what happened in that game. Palmer was one of the top quarterbacks in the league when under pressure, except not this week.
Right.
And Palmer was the top quarterback in the league throwing deep, except not this week. So I don't think I put it on Green Bay's pass rush or defensive strategies because Palmer's performance against similar pass rush earlier in the year was different.
Yeah, Green Bay, actually, they generated 10 sacks, pressures, hits, and hurries last week. But on the season, the Cardinals averaged allowing 12.5, so that wasn't a particularly dominant pass rushing performance by any means by the Packers.
So the question is, how much is the finger injury? How much is playoff experience? And how much is random variation? And you know me, my likely explanation for things is going to be random variation. I think random variation is always underestimated as a factor in things like this. We look for, what's the famous XCD comic about? Like, let's find random numbers with a random number generator and build stories around them. And underneath the caption says all sports analysis.
Exactly. Yeah.
So the fact is, I think random variation does have a lot to do with these things. Otherwise, I do wonder about the finger injury because right? We've seen 2 games since the finger injury, and the other one was them getting their asses kicked by Seattle. I don't believe that strongly in the question of playoff inexperience causing huge problems. There are too many examples of teams, quarterbacks, etc., who did not have a lot of playoff experience playing well in the playoffs. Colin Kaepernick going to the Super Bowl in 2012, and Brady, if you want to go back to 2001, and Eli Manning didn't have a lot of playoff experience before 2007, and things seemed to be fine for the Giants that year. I don't remember anybody saying, "Oh, Eli Manning has no playoff experience. How did the Giants manage to win? He must have gotten Michael Strahan must have given him a mojo injection or something, whatever a mojo injection is. I don't know what that is." And if Palmer had won, you would be, "Oh, he was so experienced. He's 35 years old. He's been doing this for so long." So I'm just not a big believer in the idea. I understand what the Panthers said about their butts got tight, but I'm just not a big believer in this idea of playoff and experience having a huge role in the struggles. I would attribute it a lot more to the finger and random variation.
So from the Panther side of things, obviously they had their own sort of excitement last week when they went up huge on the Seahawks early and then nearly gave the game away in the second half, despite that 31-point lead. It actually wasn't the first time this year that the Panthers had built a huge lead and then nearly given the game away. And I don't even want to say given the game away, but they lost the lead one way or the other. And I wanted to talk to you about that, Aaron. Is there anything to that as a pattern that you think, is there something maybe about the Panthers when they get those big leagues that is maybe revealing a weakness that is real in their team that could be a factor in this game? Or do you think that when the team builds a lead like that, it just leads to differences in play calling, differences in strategies, or maybe differences in, concentration and commitment by the players, which seems obviously natural? What is it that's causing these big leads to vanish on the Panthers in the second halves?
It is something that happens with play calling, but it does seem to be happening to the Panthers more than other teams. I feel like, it's not like the Panthers have been poor in our numbers this year, but I wonder if you're sort of in the same situation as a sort of advanced stats guy who roots for Carolina that like Barnwell was when he was writing for me in 2007 and the Giants went on that run, where you're like, on one hand, advanced stats tell you one thing, and on the other hand, your rooting interests are like, yes, Panthers! like I got to tell you, Panthers fans were total dicks to me in the first half of that game on Twitter. They are so angry about our stats, having Carolina not number one. And I don't begrudge, listen, the fans of all 32 teams will act like that in a similar situation. It's not like there's anything special about Carolina fans that they were jackasses. There is a group of fans like that from every team. I know because those Patriots fans who are like that found me all the way back in 2005 when I was writing, they're not going to win the Super Bowl for a third straight year. They're not as good as they were in 2004. And Patriots fans were writing me saying, "Oh, you hate the Patriots," and blah, blah, blah. We just didn't have Twitter back then. So they couldn't do it, in real time. But I'm just sitting there in the first half of that game going well, this is pretty bad. But it's like I can't even enjoy how awesome Carolina's playing because these people are bitching at me so much. And yet none of them responded at the end of the game with, "Hi." At the end, it did turn out to be a close game like you thought it was going to, it turns out Seattle is pretty good and Carolina is also pretty good. And they played a game where both teams looked pretty good just for some reason, not at the same time. What a weird game. Can we pause for a moment to say how crazy it was that Seattle so outplayed Carolina in the second half and Carolina so outplayed Seattle in the first half? And I realize people say, well, in the second half with the lead that big, they just want to slow the game down. And that's true. And you do have to give Carolina a little bit of credit for a couple of big third down conversions in the second half. But when you're running out the clock, it helps to get more than a yard per carrier. Their running game totally shut down at the end, which is why they kept having to punt the ball back, and that's not a good thing, right?
Right. You can look at this game from multiple perspectives. It's hard not for me to look in retrospect at the game and think that the Seahawks might not have been the better team in the first place. Because, you saw Jonathan Stewart, first run of the game, get 60 yards, couldn't run the rest of the way. The Seahawks pretty much shut that down. And a lot of the Panthers' early scoring were the result of really well-timed turnovers for them, like the Kuechly interception return for a touchdown. After that, it really seemed like the Seahawks, maybe they were loose or whatever the case was, but they didn't really have a ton of trouble moving the ball against the Panthers, and the Panthers couldn't move the ball at all against them.
I will say, if you look at the league, let's look at the league for the whole season. Okay, so when the scoring gap is more than 14 points, okay, the Carolina defense allows 6.1 yards per play. When the other team is behind by more than 14 points.
Right. Yeah.
The rest of the time they allow 4.6. That's a huge gap.
It is.
For the league as a whole, that same gap is 5.6 and 5.6.
So no gap at all.
Correct. So that is a huge difference from the league as a whole. Carolina's defensive DVOA most of the time, 22.8%, minus 22.8%. When they had a lead of at least 15 points, it was minus 3.7%. So still better than average, but much different than it was overall. The league as a whole, the defensive DVOA is roughly the same in either of those times. So that is an example of how this was a problem for the entire year. And by the way, it's an offensive problem too.
Yes.
The league as a whole, when the offense is leading by 15 or more points, 5.5 yards per play. I'm looking at the wrong number here. Sorry, 5.4 yards per play. The rest of the time, 5.6 yards per play. Carolina, when leading the game by 15 or more points, 3.9 yards per play. The rest of the time, 6 yards per play. So it's not just a defensive problem, it's an offensive problem. They do get too conservative because the fact, I guess, that their game depends on the run in general anyway. So now when you have a team that likes to run and they're in a situation where they're going to run, you can really stack the run.
Indeed. I had a hypothesis. I can't even talk. I had a hypothesis about this, Aaron, but when I checked into it, it didn't actually prove anything. Just based on watching those Panthers losing those leads, what I remember happening was teams moved into a hurry up and then really had success moving the ball against it. And the Panthers were unable to generate a pass rush because I guess their same guys were on the field, getting tired, unable to switch off. The Panthers have a deep line, but maybe not a ton of great players on the line itself.
Well, they do actually have great players and a deep line. I mean, if you think about Dwan Edwards is a pretty underrated player, and that's their third defensive tackle. So.
Well, their tackles are outstanding and really good at pass rushing.
The ends are not as
on the edge, maybe not as much. But the fact of the matter is, they generated 26 sacks, pressures, hits, and hurries in the 3 second halves where they were, basically losing big leads against the Colts, the Giants, and then last week against the Seahawks, which puts them on a full season pace to lead the league in that. So, I mean, I think it's not really true. I don't think that's what was happening itself. And frankly, I don't know whether it's all just strategy changes or whether it's related to personnel or psyche or whatever else is the case. But it's definitely been a thing. But, I mean, chances are it's probably not something we have to worry about against the remaining really good teams in the playoffs. But I guess we'll see.
The other thing I'd say about that game and whether Seattle was better than Carolina is that whether Seattle was actually better than Carolina in the regular season, Carolina now, we've talked so much about the injuries in the AFC. There are a couple of huge injuries that Carolina has had to deal with, losing Benwerke and Tillman in recent weeks.
Yeah.
They're down to Josh Norman and, guys from they pulled out of the stands.
About literally, at least with Cortland Finnegan, yeah.
Yeah, Robert McLean, who was cut by the Patriots in the preseason and is really much better as a nickelback. He's now like an outside corner for them. So that is a huge weakness going up against Arizona. That's why I've been worried all season. I think I've talked about it on the podcast.
You have.
As a Patriots fan, the team that worries me is not Carolina, but Arizona, because of the three great receivers plus J.J. Nelson going deep. So, three great ones plus whatever you would call J.J. Nelson at this point against a not very deep cornerback group. And Carolina faces that this week.
Yeah, and basically the Cardinals are the worst possible matchup for that situation for the Panthers right now because, you can put Norman on one side of the field and maybe take away Michael Floyd, but then you have Larry Fitzgerald, then you have J.J. Nelson. I mean, it could be a real problem for them if they can't actually generate their pass rush against the Cardinals.
The Seattle game was definitely pass to guy not covered by Norman.
Exactly.
Pass to guy not covered by Norman. Pass to guy not covered by Norman. Like over and over. Who's covering that guy? Not Norman.
So, I mean, I think it wouldn't be surprising at all to see the Cardinals put up some points against the Panthers this week. But the question is from the other side of things, what can the Cardinals do to stop the unorthodox Panthers offense? I think of them as being sort of a very good team against the pass, but obviously the Panthers are the run-heaviest team in the league. How are they at stopping the run?
Excellent.
That's what I was thinking.
This is the interesting thing about this game. I think it would help both teams. It would behoove both teams to go away from their standard way of doing business in the Panthers offense versus Cardinals defense matchup. Arizona was second in the league in adjusted line yards on defense and second in the league in stuff rate of opposing running backs, and that was first before the game against Seattle in Week 17. So they were a very strong team against the run all year. But Arizona blitzes more than any other team in the league, right? 45% of opponents' dropbacks this season, they sent 5 or more pass rushers. That leads the league. They will blitz in any situation at any time. They are one of the rare teams that blitzes more often on first down than they do on third. They're one of the rare teams that actually blitzes more often than they don't in the red zone.
Wow.
They blitz all the time. They blitzed on a freaking Hail Mary under the screen day, okay? It's insane.
That works.
Who is the most blitzed quarterback in the league this year?
Is it Cam? I have no idea.
No, it's Josh McCown. But number 2 is Cam.
Okay.
Right. And I just needed a Josh McCown reference just to clear the palate.
I like it.
Cam Newton was blitzed more than any starting quarterback other than Josh McCown. And guess what? He's great against it.
I mean, that makes total sense given his escapability. I'm surprised that he is blitzed so often.
I'm a little surprised too because maybe teams felt like they didn't need to have guys in coverage because they're trying to cover Corey Brown and Jericho Cotchery's like 45 years old.
Yeah, fair point.
I don't know, man, but Newton he gets more than with 3 to 4 pass rushers, it's like net 6.5 yards per pass. With 5, it's 7.5. And then with 6 or 7, it goes down to 6.6. But he threw no interceptions this year against big blitzes of 6 or more.
That's crazy.
So Arizona's favorite strategy is playing right into Cam Newton's hands.
Huh. Well, that's really interesting. I wonder what the Cardinals will actually do. I mean, Arians is sort of a risk-happy guy. I think they'll probably just do it, right?
They're Honey Badger, man. They're the Honey Badger team. The Honey Badger's on the team. It's the Honey Badger defense. Honey Badger don't care.
Well, I kind of feel that way.
How much you beat the blitz. He's blitzing anyway.
I kind of feel that way about the Panthers offense, too, where it's just like, oh, you like to stop the run? Well, we're going to run and run and run and run. So,
right, but it's going to be, obviously, look, there'll be different types of runs because you'll have read options and you'll have options. And by the way, let me just digress. How amazing was it to watch Kansas City run a triple option against the Patriots? That was hilarious. In the Andy Reid drinking game, it's like drink an entire bottle of scotch. But they'll run some more interesting plays. Arizona's got a very fast defense, right? So they're going to range wide against those plays. So I'm not sure how well those plays will work, except I believe that from the SIS numbers of charting, Arizona is near the top of the league in how frequently they missed tackles on defense. That's what happens when you play smaller, faster defenders is you get more broken tackles. And, of course, guys are going to be bouncing off Cam Newton like Superman. Bing, bing, bing. Like, go ahead, shoot your Dion Buchanan bullet at Superman. Boom. It'll just bounce right off him.
Not just him.
Matchups really favor. I think that unless Arizona can somehow protect Palmer so well that those guys are getting open downfield against those lesser cornerbacks all day long, I think the matchups really favor Carolina in this game.
Well, it'll be interesting to see. I'm super looking forward to it, obviously. Before we wrap up today's show, let me remind everyone again that the Off the Charts Football Podcast is presented to you by FantasyInsiders.com, your source for daily fantasy sports content. Their slogan is Accuracy Matters, and it shows since they've won the Daily Fantasy Accuracy Competition for the past 3 years. If you're serious about DFS or want to become serious, check out FantasyInsiders.com for free educational content and premium memberships. So for everyone that's subscribed to the show, just a heads up that I think Aaron and I are planning to do our recording of the Super Bowl preview show, not next week leading up to the Pro Bowl, but afterwards. So probably something like 10 days from now. So definitely check out that show when it comes. Aaron, I'm guessing you and I are both hoping to see the Panthers and Patriots make it that far. And if so, then we may have quite a good Super Bowl preview show.
And I'm hoping to not see the Pro Bowl. Woo! Night off.
Exactly.
Off.
It's well deserved for you, Aaron. So I hope you enjoy your brief time off. And I hope everyone else enjoyed the show today. And then I hope they catch us out then for that Super Bowl preview show. Have a good one.